My son sent me a text message at exactly 11:42 p.m. I am Douglas Carter, 68 years old. It was a quiet Tuesday night. I was meticulously sanding down a rough edge on the top shelf of a wooden bookcase I was building, when suddenly, my cell phone vibrated violently against my workbench. Dad, Brittany and I have been talking. We think it's best if you stop coming over unannounced. We need our own space. We want peace. Please respect our boundaries. I read that text message twice, then narrowed my eyes and read it a third time, just to make sure the eyesight of a 68-year-old man wasn't deceiving me. I started to recall the last time I had visited their house. I had simply dropped by to bring my grandson, Leo, a small wooden toy truck I had hand-carved myself. I had stayed for exactly 15 minutes. My gaze slowly drifted to the unfinished oak bookcase. I was building it for Leo's upcoming 5th birthday. I slowly dragged my heavy feet up the stairs, walked into the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. We want peace. Those words repeated on an endless loop, echoing bitterly in the empty space of my kitchen. I slumped into a chair at the dining table, feeling an exhausting fatigue spread through every neuron in my body. Understood. Done. The next morning, the sun rose over the horizon, exactly as it always has. I slowly stood up, walked to the front door, and turned the knob. Brandon was standing there, looking impatient. "Hey, Dad," he tossed out casually, walking straight into the house without bothering to wait for me to step aside or invite him in. I stood in silence, my eyes closely tracking his every movement. He bypassed me completely, heading straight for my coffee maker, pouring himself a mug as if he owned the place. "You really need to buy better coffee beans, Dad. This stuff tastes like dirt." I slowly pushed the front door shut, making sure the deadbolt clicked loudly. Brandon slammed his coffee mug down on the counter, reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. "Look, about that text last night," he began, waving his hand in an incredibly condescending manner, as if swatting away an annoying fly. "Brittany is just under a lot of stress lately. We just need some time to ourselves without having to host guests." "Guests," the word struck a nerve. "I understand what boundaries are," I said slowly. "Good," Brandon nodded, a look of relief washing over his face. He aggressively slid the piece of paper across the counter toward me. "I need you to handle this, Dad," he said, his eyes already glued to his phone screen as he checked his emails. He wasn't asking, he was giving an order. I lowered my eyes to the paper. It was a repair bill for his wife's luxury SUV, total cost $400. I looked back up, staring deeply into my son's face. I had foolishly hoped that his early morning visit was meant to be an apology for the disrespectful late-night text. But I was wrong. He had only come here to use me as his personal ATM. I silently turned on my heel and walked slowly toward the wooden drawer where I always kept my checkbook. I pulled the drawer open and retrieved the checkbook. Brandon let out a loud sigh of relief that echoed clearly in the kitchen. He thought the crisis was averted. He thought the next few weeks of his life were secured. I flipped the checkbook open. I pulled the pen from my shirt pocket and carefully filled in the date, his name, and the exact amount, $400. I lifted the check, admiring it for a moment. Then, I gripped the edge of the paper and decisively tore the check out of the book. Brandon immediately reached his hand out, his fingers stretching to grab it. But I didn't hand the check to him. "You said you wanted peace, right, Brandon?" I asked softly. "Yeah, Dad, we just need our own space," I smirked. "Peace is an incredibly expensive commodity." "Son," I said, my voice deep and articulating every single syllable. And then, with two slow, deliberate, and powerful motions, I ripped the $400 check straight down the middle. Brandon turned to stone. "Dad," he breathed, his voice trembling as if he had just seen a ghost. "What are you doing?" "I am respecting your boundaries," I replied, my tone remaining completely indifferent. I let the torn pieces of the check flutter from my fingers, landing softly on the kitchen floor like dead leaves. "Are you crazy?" he suddenly screamed, his face flushing red with anger and sheer panic. "The mechanic won't release her car until that bill is paid." "That sounds like a problem for the person whose name is on the title." I coldly interrupted him. You're doing this just to punish me. He hissed through gritted teeth, spitting as he spoke. I am not punishing you. I lowered my voice, cutting through his hysteria. I am simply taking a step back, exactly as you requested. I am giving you the space you so desperately demanded. I raised my arm and pointed straight at the closed front door. Get the hell out of my house, Brandon. He stood rooted to the spot for a few seconds, his hands balling into fists so tight, his knuckles turned stark white. Fine, he sneered, a twisted, contemptuous smile forming on his lips. If you want to play it like this, old man, then don't expect to see us for Thanksgiving. He furiously turned on his heel and took long, angry strides out of my house, slamming the door behind him. I stood there, completely alone in the middle of my large kitchen. I glanced up at the wall calendar. It was October 12th. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Sylvia Ross, attorney at law. She answered on the second ring, her tone professional and decisive. It's Douglas, Doug, she replied, her voice instantly softening into the familiarity of a decades-long friendship. Is everything all right? Everything is perfectly stable, Sylvia, I answered calmly. I need you to prepare the paperwork. I'm coming to the office. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. She knew exactly what the paperwork meant. Are you absolutely sure about this decision, Doug? She asked softly. I looked down at the torn blue scraps of paper scattered across the kitchen floor. I am absolutely certain, I said firmly. I hung up the phone. I slowly walked back to the garage, my eyes resting on the unfinished oak bookcase. I had spent the last 5 years carefully building a comfortable, insulated bubble for my son and his wife. And now, I was going to be the needle that popped it. And I was going to make sure that the explosion was absolutely spectacular. The drive down the highway into downtown Seattle that day was a blur of gray concrete and heavy rain lashing against the windshield. Seattle is a city overflowing with quiet millionairesmen in faded flannel shirts driving beat-up trucks, holding vast fortunes in diversified assets. I was one of those quiet millionaires, even though it seemed my only son had completely forgotten this minor, yet incredibly crucial, detail. Sylvia didn't greet me with a warm hug when I walked into her corner office on the top floor. She took one look at my face and immediately knew that the time for pleasantries was over. Sylvia and I had worked together for nearly 30 years. She was the legal architect behind my entire empire. I slumped into a chair without saying a word, quietly placing the torn scraps of the check onto her impeccably clean desk. I want to invoke Clause 14b, I said, shattering the silence. Sylvia paused. Clause 14b, she repeated, drawing out the words. The revocation of residency privileges for the Oak Creek property. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany desk. They fired the first shot, Sylvia. He marched into my house this morning, demanded I pay his wife's auto repair bill, and then had the audacity to tell me to stay away from his family. Sylvia sighed, her long fingers clicking a few commands into her keyboard. It's going to get incredibly ugly, Doug, she warned. Are you prepared for the fallout? I blinked at the Excel spreadsheet she pulled up on her monitor. It meticulously detailed every single expense I had covered for that house over the past 5 years. The mortgage payments, the property taxes, the homeowner's insurance, the landscaping fees. The list went on, including endless supplementary transfers to cover their emergencies. Who currently holds the title to the property, Sylvia? I asked, even though I already knew the answer perfectly well. The Carter Family Trust holds the deed, she replied, her voice turning sharp and professional. Brandon and Brittany are listed solely as beneficiaries with residency privileges, completely contingent upon the approval of the trust's executor. Which is you. And what about his employment contract? I continued. Sylvia pulled out a second file folder. Brandon is listed as a business development consultant for your holding company, Apex Construction Group, drawing a base salary of $120,000 a year, plus full benefits. And what actual business has he developed? I asked sarcastically. Sylvia didn't bother answering. We both knew the answer was absolute zero. He spent his days playing golf and treating my company like a personal slush fund. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a cold chill run down my spine and tighten my stomach. I had spent my entire life trying to be the fertile soil that allowed my son to grow. But instead of growing strong roots, he had become a fragile weed, choking out everything around him. And now I had to become a severe drought, draft the legal documents. I ordered decisively. Sylvia took a deep breath. All right, let's get specific. Which documents are we executing? All of them, I growled. That single word hung in the office air, carrying an absolute, irreversible weight. First, I continued, trying to keep my voice steady, the notice to vacate. Clause 14b gives them exactly 30 days to vacate the premises upon formal written notice. Correct? Correct, Sylvia answered, not looking up. I am ready, I said. Sylvia nodded, flipping to the next page. And what about the private school tuition for Leo? She asked quietly, a hint of concern in her eyes. I squeezed my eyes shut for a fraction of a second. Cancel the direct deposit for the tuition immediately, I ordered. Sylvia stopped writing. You have calculated every single move, she observed. I am an engineer, Sylvia. I know exactly which load-bearing walls to knock down to bring the whole structure collapsing to the ground. There is one final matter, I added. Sylvia frowned in thought. The loan from 2 years ago. The $50,000 cash advance you gave them for that kitchen renovation. Exactly, I confirmed. Call in that debt immediately. Sylvia was so startled she dropped her pen on the desk. Dog, that was a demand note. If you call it in and they can't pay, they'll be financially ruined. I slowly stood up, walking step by step toward the massive glass window. He told me he wanted to be independent, I said to my own reflection in the glass. I spun around to face Sylvia. Execute all the legal documents, Sylvia. Spare absolutely no one. Sylvia typed in silence for 20 straight minutes. She gathered the documents into a stack and slid them across the desk toward me. Read them very carefully, Douglas, she instructed solemnly. I didn't bother reading them. I picked up the pen and signed my name on the bottom line of the notice to vacate. I signed the next page, Douglas Carter, lender, and I signed the final page. Douglas Carter, father. That last signature was the heaviest and most painful stroke of the pen. I dropped the pen on the desk. It's done, I declared. Sylvia carefully placed the papers into a folder. I stood up and calmly buttoned my suit jacket. I'm going to drive home, I said, and I'm going to sit on my porch, drink a cup of tea, and wait. Wait for what? Wait for the screaming, I smiled bitterly. I walked out of the office without looking back. As I drove out of the underground parking garage, bursting out of the darkness and into the glaring daylight, I suddenly felt a single, hot tear roll down my cheek. The next 7 days were the most peacefully quiet days I had experienced in my entire life. For the first time in 20 solid years, my phone didn't ring with some ridiculous, fabricated emergency. I started getting into the habit of waking up at 6 o'clock every morning. Not because I had to rush to a construction site, nor because I was jolted awake by the anxiety of Brandon's disastrous financial situation, but simply because the morning sunlight was gently dancing across the blooming azaleas in my backyard. I suddenly realized that for the past few decades, I had been living in a constant, low-level state of chronic stress. I started taking long morning walks. I felt as though President Teddy Roosevelt himself was smiling down in approval at what I was doing. Meanwhile, halfway across the city, I knew full well that my silence was being interpreted in the exact opposite direction. They had absolutely no idea that the eviction notice was currently sitting quietly in a mail sorting facility, slowly rolling its wheels of death toward their front door, creeping forward like an unstoppable torpedo locked onto its target. On a Friday afternoon, the silence was finally broken. I was in my living room, leisurely reorganizing my collection of vintage vinyl records. When my phone rang, the caller ID flashed. Brittany. I deliberately let it ring 3 times before picking up. Hello, I said calmly. Hi, Dad. Brittany's voice pierced through the speaker, vibrating with an obnoxiously fake, high-pitched cheerfulness. Hello, Brittany. I didn't bother asking how she was doing. So, she continued, her fake enthusiasm already starting to show awkward cracks. I'm calling about Leo's birthday party next weekend. We're planning a massive superhero-themed bash at the country club. That sounds like a wonderful plan for the boy, I replied indifferently. Yes, exactly. The thing is, the country club requires a $5,000 deposit by tomorrow. I checked Brandon's account this morning, and the usual transfer for the party fund hasn't come through yet. $5,000 for a 5-year-old's birthday party. I took a slow sip of my tea. I've already taken care of Leo's birthday gift, I said, my voice steady and deliberate. A dead silence fell over the line. Oh, she finally muttered, her voice dropping an entire octave. Well, what about the deposit? I didn't transfer any money into Brandon's account, I replied. And I haven't mailed any checks either. That was the breaking point for Brittany's patience. All right, Douglas, you need to stop playing these sick games right now. She snapped, dropping the dad act instantly. Are you seriously going to punish your own grandson just because you had a little argument with Brandon? I leaned back into my comfortable armchair. I am not punishing Leo, I growled. I set up a 529 college savings account for him. The money is securely locked away for his future education, completely out of your reach. But what about the party? Then you and Brandon can reach into your own pockets and pay for the party yourselves. I answered, my voice as sharp as a razor. You can't do this, she roared like a rabid animal. You're ruining everything. You can fill that boy's head with whatever garbage you want, I sneered. But the bank of Dad is permanently closed. I'm putting Brandon on the phone right now, she threatened maliciously. I highly recommend Brandon doesn't waste his phone minutes talking to me right now, I mocked. What the hell is that supposed to mean? She demanded. It means, Brittany, that the party is officially over. In every sense of the word, I hung up on her. I gently lifted my teacup again and took a sip, easily imagining the chaotic meltdown currently taking place in their house. But the most terrifying part was that the real storm hadn't even made landfall yet. Saturday arrived with brilliant, blazing sunshine, the kind of perfect weather that real estate agents pray for. While I sat leisurely on my porch, 5 miles away, reading my book and sipping cheap coffee, my precious son and his wife were hosting the social event of the summer in the exact backyard that I had broken my back to pay for. The Oak Creek backyard was designed for one single purpose, to generate intense envy among their peers. And standing proudly in the center of that fake perfection was Brandon, flipping expensive steaks on a stainless steel grill. Brittany was holding a miniature court near the artificial fire pit. I could perfectly imagine her shrill voice carrying over the manicured lawn. We're actually planning to tear this all up and expand the patio next spring, she would brag, waving her hand dismissively at the flawless slate stone beneath her feet. Her friends, Tiffany and Jessica, would nod sympathetically, sipping their mimosas. Everyone was whispering. They would complain about their own trivial problems, and Brittany would inevitably roll her eyes and steer the conversation back to her favorite subject. Me. Oh, Douglas is just throwing another one of his pathetic tantrums, she would laugh, tossing her hair over her shoulder. We had to set some firm boundaries with him. He thinks that just because he helps out occasionally, he owns us. You did the right thing, babe, Tiffany would praise her. Exactly, Brittany would smile smugly, raising her champagne flute. The party was reaching its peak of obnoxious revelry when the sound of reality, crashing down, finally arrived. It wasn't a gentle, subtle sound. A FedEx delivery truck aggressively pulled up to the curb. The driver jumped out, carrying a thick, legal-sized envelope. Brandon looked up from the grill. He met the driver at the edge of the patio. Are you Brandon Carter? The driver asked bluntly, not looking up from his barcode scanner. Yeah, that's me, Brandon replied. Sign here, the driver ordered coldly, completely ignoring the high society atmosphere surrounding them. Brandon hurriedly scribbled a messy signature on the scanner screen. The driver handed him the heavy envelope and walked away without another word. Brandon stood frozen, clutching the envelope to his chest. He glanced at the return address, Ross and Associates, attorneys at law, Sylvia, Brandon's heart must have skipped a beat. He turned his back to the drinking guests, using his body to shield the envelope from view as he tore it open. The first piece of paper wasn't a check, notice to vacate premise. Brandon blinked rapidly. He skimmed the first paragraph. Dear Mr. Carter, please be advised that your status as a resident beneficiary of the property located at 2445 Oak Creek Road is hereby revoked and terminated immediately, pursuant to Clause 14B of the Carter Family Trust. The color violently drained from Brandon's face. He frantically flipped to the second document. Notter of intent to sell property. This notice serves to inform you that the aforementioned property is currently in the process of being listed for sale on the open market. Sell, that single word hit him harder than a sledgehammer to the gut. His legs went weak as he flipped to the third page. It clearly stated they had exactly 30 days to remove all personal belongings and vacate the premises, or face forceful eviction by county sheriffs. 30 days. Right at that moment, Brittany's shrill voice pierced through his fog of panic. Babe, who was that at the door? Brandon jumped as if he had been electrocuted. He spun around, frantically shoving the documents into the pocket of his apron. Oh, it was just a delivery, he stammered, his voice trembling violently. Brittany sauntered over to him, holding her champagne glass. Well, obviously it was a delivery, Brandon. Did your dad finally cave and send the check for Leo's deposit? She was unknowingly throwing him an anvil while he was drowning. Brandon stared at her, his throat completely dry. Yeah, he swallowed hard. Yeah, he sent it. Brittany's face lit up as if she had struck gold. I told you guys, she shrieked, turning back to her friends triumphantly. I knew the old man would crack. The guests erupted into a chorus of loud, obnoxious cheers. Brandon forced a sickeningly fake nod, his face as pale as a ghost. He turned back to the grill. He could feel the physical heat of the legal envelope burning against his thigh through the thin fabric of his apron. A wave of dizzying nausea washed over him. The blazing summer sun beat down on his head mercilessly. Are you okay, babe? Brittany called out from afar. I'm fine, Brandon rasped, but he wasn't fine. The worst part for him in that exact moment wasn't even the terrifying prospect of impending homelessness. The worst part was knowing that he was standing in the middle of a lavish party, surrounded by people he was trying to impress, pretending to be a king while holding his own execution warrant in his pocket. For a brief moment, I almost felt a flicker of pity for him. Almost, very well, son, I thought to myself as I turned the page of my book on my quiet porch. It was past 11 o'clock that night when the storm finally hit. I didn't even need to pull back the curtains to know who was approaching my house. I gently closed my book. The violent pounding on my front door started seconds later. Bang, 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 open the door! Brandon roared, his voice hoarse and raw, desperately trying to overpower the howling wind and pouring rain. I took a deep breath, slowly smoothing the wrinkles out of my expensive slacks, and calmly walked over to open the door. They looked like a walking tragedy. Brandon and Brittany stood on my porch, completely drenched, their hair plastered to their faces. They didn't even wait for an invitation before pushing past me into the hallway. You are a total psychopath! Brandon screamed hysterically. I calmly closed the door, sealing out the storm. I am completely aware of my actions, I replied, lowering my voice to a dangerous whisper. Did you really think we wouldn't find out? Brittany shrieked. She was shaking violently, but it wasn't from the cold. We had to humiliate ourselves and kick all our guests out. Brandon yelled, pacing the hallway like a caged animal. He reached into his wet pocket and pulled out the crumpled, rain-soaked legal documents. A notice to vacate. He spat the words out like venom. I looked down at the soggy papers in his hand. I am treating you exactly the way landlords treat ungrateful tenants, I said coldly. That is our house, Brittany roared, lunging forward until she was inches from my face. I stared her down. Brittany, I said slowly, keeping my hands clasped behind my back. The house belongs to the Carter Family Trust, and I am the sole executor. You can't do this to us, Dad. Brandon interrupted, his voice finally breaking with genuine fear. I almost laughed. I highly suggest you go home and carefully read those documents again, I said. Because Clause 14b clearly states that any damage to the property will result in immediate legal action. Damage to the property, Brandon shouted defensively. You had the audacity to demand money from me to fix a car that you crashed. I flatly shut down his excuses. This is all because of that stupid mechanic bill, isn't it? Brittany hissed like a venomous snake, glaring at me with defiant expectation. This has absolutely nothing to do with the car, I answered coldly. I brushed past them, walking straight into the living room. Where are you going? Brandon yelled, frantically following me. I stopped next to the fireplace and turned to face him. We are finished here, Brandon. Are you really selling it? He asked, his voice suddenly shrinking to a pathetic whisper. Exactly, I replied. You can't sell it. He begged, tears finally spilling from his eyes. Then you should pull out your checkbook and buy it yourself. I shot back, my voice as cold as ice. But we spent our own money adding value to that property. Brittany screeched from the hallway. Your hard-earned money. I raised an eyebrow, mocking her. She instantly fell silent. That's what I thought. I delivered the fatal blow. Brandon collapsed onto my sofa. He was shattered. But I was no longer in the business of cleaning up his messes. Dad, please. He sobbed uncontrollably. I knew they were going to play this specific card. Leo will be perfectly fine, I said steadily, though my heart ached slightly at the mention of my grandson. I have secured his future. You are destroying his life. Brittany screamed, tears streaming down her face. I looked at them with utter disgust. I am not the one who is making him homeless, Brittany. I ground out every single syllable. You two did that by refusing to act like adults. Are you going to save us or not? Brandon snapped his head up. You should probably start packing your boxes right now, I said indifferently. He stumbled to his feet. Fine, he hissed. I slowly nodded. Go ahead and try, I challenged him. He flinched, shrinking back as if I had physically struck him. And regarding Leo, I added, my voice dropping to a menacing whisper, I suggest you both find jobs very quickly, because the judge in family court won't look favorably on two unemployed parents trying to secure custody. Unemployed? Brandon frowned in confusion. I have a job. I looked at him with genuine pity. Make sure you check your email on Monday morning. Son, what did you do? I am the silent investor behind Apex Construction, Brandon, I stated softly. He stared at me in pure horror. You fired me. I didn't fire you, I corrected him. I simply informed the CEO that I will no longer be subsidizing your useless position. He couldn't utter a single word in response. Get out, I growled. They stood frozen. Get the hell out of my house! I roared, the sound echoing off the walls. Brittany hurriedly grabbed Brandon's arm and dragged her husband toward the front door. I hate you, he whispered through gritted teeth. I know, I answered coldly. They walked out into the pouring rain. I rested my forehead against the cool wood of the front door. I reached out and turned off the porch light. They were gone. I went back to the kitchen, picked up my tea, and took a sip. Good, I whispered. Into the empty room I sat in the dark, listening to the heavy rain wash away their tire tracks from my driveway. Monday was going to be an incredibly long day. Monday morning arrived like a judge's wooden gavel, slamming down on the bench. At exactly 8:55 a.m. inside the house on Oak Creek, Brittany was frantically scrubbing a red wine stain off the white marble kitchen counter. She was desperately trying to ignore the official email from the real estate agency that had arrived earlier. At exactly 9 a.m., a sleek black sedan smoothly pulled into their driveway. The driver was Courtney, the top real estate agent in the city, and coincidentally, a woman Brittany had ruthlessly bullied back in high school. Ironically, Courtney now held the master key to Brittany's fate. Brittany froze like a statue when she saw Courtney's silhouette through the kitchen window. The doorbell rang. It was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. Hello, Courtney's voice rang out, carrying a sickeningly cheerful and professional tone. Brittany rushed into the hallway, pulling her robe tightly around herself. You are not allowed in here, she shrieked. Courtney paused. Brittany, she said, her voice as smooth as velvet. I have a legally binding contract to prepare this property for an open house. You can either let me in, or I can call the sheriff to escort you out. Your choice. While Brittany was forced to face her old high school nemesis inside her own home, on the other side of the city, inside the glass headquarters of Apex Construction Group, Brandon was sluggishly dragging his feet towards the elevator. He looked absolutely pathetic. He pressed the button for the 14th floor. I am a moneymaker, he desperately muttered to himself, trying to regain his confidence. The elevator chimed, but as he walked past the reception desk, the receptionist kept her head down, avoiding eye contact. Brandon confidently strode toward his private office door. He frowned in confusion when he saw a cardboard box sitting on his desk. Hey, Sarah, he called out to his assistant, who was hunched over her desk 10 feet away. Sarah didn't stand up. I can't do that, Mr. Carter, she whispered, her voice shaking. Mr. Sterling wants to see you in the boardroom, immediately, back at the Oak Creek house. The invasion had officially begun and was operating at maximum intensity. Brittany stood huddled in the corner of her kitchen, completely cornered by Courtney. You have no right to do this, Courtney, Brittany hissed through gritted teeth. Courtney calmly opened the file folder she was holding. It doesn't seem like there's any misunderstanding here, Britt. Courtney smiled, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the paper. She looked up, her eyes flashing with malicious delight. To be honest, this is actually pretty tragic, she continued, rubbing salt in the wound. That is our house, Brittany screamed in desperation. Was your house? Courtney coldly corrected her, heavily emphasizing the past tense. Courtney swept her gaze around the kitchen. You know how frozen and dismal the real estate market is right now, she said with fake sympathy. Brittany felt a sharp sting behind her eyes, her nose burning with unshed tears. Meanwhile, inside the soundproof boardroom on the 14th floor, the air conditioning was humming quietly, but Brandon was sweating profusely. Brandon, Sterling began in a monotone voice, not even bothering to look up from his papers. Brandon tried to force a distorted, awkward smile onto his face. Is this about an internal restructuring, sir? Sterling finally lifted his head. Did you not hear me, Brandon? Your position has been liquidated. Brandon felt as though he had been struck by lightning. Liquidated. You were merely the figurehead for a single source of investment capital, Sterling replied coldly. He slid a thin piece of paper across the boardroom table. We received this formal notice on Saturday for me? Brandon stammered, his voice trembling. Sterling shook his head slightly. Douglas Carter. Brandon stared blankly at the name. My father, he whispered hopelessly. Exactly. Sterling confirmed. And now what? Brandon asked, sounding like a man taking his final breath. Sterling aggressively slammed his folder shut. And now, he has officially declared that the experiment is over. Sterling let out a heavy sigh of exhaustion. He slowly took off his reading glasses and wiped them clean. Let's be completely honest with each other, Brandon. You were kept on the payroll strictly because your father was funding major projects. And now that check has bounced. Sterling pressed a button on the intercom system. Security, please send an escort up to the boardroom immediately. Brandon felt his knees turn to jelly. He could no longer stand. He collapsed into his chair. He fired me, he muttered, his eyes glazed over. My own flesh and blood ruthlessly fired me. He didn't fire you, Sterling coldly corrected him. He simply stopped paying us to keep you around. Back at Oak Creek, the doorbell rang again. Courtney glanced at her diamond wristwatch. Right on time, she chimed happily. Try to look a little more presentable. Britt, it's incredibly unprofessional for buyers to see the previous tenants looking so disheveled. Brittany stood rooted to the spot, her entire body shaking with rage. Get out, she hissed weakly. Courtney treated the threat like empty air. She strolled over to the front door and threw it open. Welcome. The natural lighting is absolutely perfect for a viewing right now. A man walked silently into the foyer. He scanned the entryway with a calculating, critical eye. Nice floors, the man remarked. Solid hardwood or laminate. That is impted solid oak. Brittany screamed hysterically from the kitchen. She had completely lost her grip. On reality, the man jumped back in surprise, staring at her in shock. Oh, I assumed the property was already vacant. It will be very soon, Courtney quickly reassured him. She's just in the process of packing her bags. Brittany stood by helplessly, as the two of them casually walked into her living room. They were putting her entire life on the auction block, piece by piece, offering it to a total stranger who was evaluating her sanctuary like a slab of meat at the butcher shop. And then, the ultimate unforgivable violation occurred. Let's head upstairs and take a look at the master suite, Courtney offered cheerfully, leading the man toward the staircase. It has a massive walk-in closet. You're going to fall in love with it. No! Brittany shrieked, scrambling toward the bottom of the stairs. My bed isn't even made. Courtney stopped on the third step. She looked down with the harsh face of reality. Then you should have made it, Courtney said sharply. You are just a guest who has overstayed her welcome and become an incredible nuisance. With that, she turned on her heel and continued up the stairs. Brittany heard the man mutter, Well, it does smell a bit musty in here, doesn't it? Brittany collapsed onto the bottom step. She gritted her teeth, forced to listen to the relentless clicking of the camera shutter upstairs, documenting the messy, pathetic ruins of her life for the entire internet to see. At that exact fateful moment, two heavily built security guards walked into the boardroom at Apex Construction. Mr. Carter, one of them said, holding out an empty cardboard box. Your company laptop and phone have already been seized. Brandon stared blankly at the box. 5 years of his career had been crumpled up and tossed into a cardboard box that weighed less than 5 pounds. You don't have the right to do this, Brandon protested weakly. I need to call my father. You can make your calls from the lobby, Sterling ordered coldly, standing up from his chair. Please escort Mr. Carter out of the building and revoke his access badge. A guard stepped forward aggressively and ripped the ID badge right off Brandon's belt. He was now just a nobody in a dirty suit holding a torn cardboard box. He stumbled to his feet. He looked back at Sterling one last time. Tell him, Brandon rasped. Tell him he is destroying my life. Sterling kept his eyes glued to his paperwork. I believe that is exactly the message he wanted to send you, Brandon. Brandon shuffled out into the hallway. The safety net had been completely pulled away. The elevator ride down to the ground floor took exactly 30 seconds. 30 seconds to fall straight from the peak of power to the absolute bottom of the abyss. When the doors opened in the main lobby, the blinding light of reality hit him square in the face. He stood frozen on the street corner, clutching the box like a madman. He pulled out his phone and frantically dialed my number. I was sitting peacefully in my kitchen. The phone rang. I ignored it. Their perfect little fantasy world had just shattered into 1,000 pieces. I took a sip of my coffee. There were still 3 more things left to do. I wasn't doing this out of personal vengeance, but any major surgery inevitably requires some spilling of blood. Welcome to the cruel real world, kids, I whispered. I muted my phone, picked up my book, and continued reading. The silence in my house was absolute, and for the first time in a very long time, I finally tasted the sweet flavor of justice. The conference room at Ross & Associates was designed for one specific purpose: psychological intimidation. The incredibly long mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the twisted, distressed faces of the people sitting around it. On one side sat my son Brandon and his wife Brittany. Brandon kept his head down, staring at his tightly clasped hands, his knuckles white. Brittany was wearing massive oversized sunglasses to hide half her face, even though we were indoors. She sat with her knees pulled up and her arms crossed, radiating a toxic mix of frantic anger and sheer terror. Sitting next to them was their defense attorney, a man named Henderson. His retainer fee was embarrassingly cheap, which alone told me everything I needed to know about their current disastrous financial situation. On the opposite side sat Sylvia Ross and me. I sat silently next to her, gazing out the window at the dark storm clouds gathering over the city skyline. Henderson cleared his throat. It was the sound of nervous insecurity. "Let's stop wasting each other's time," he began, trying to project a false sense of confidence. "You can't just act like thugs and throw them out on the street over a petty family argument." He leaned back, looking extremely proud of his intimidating opening statement. Sylvia didn't even blink. Her eyes locked onto Brandon like a heat-seeking missile. "Blood, sweat, and tears, was it?" she repeated softly. "Unfortunately, in a court of law we only believe in receipts and paid invoices." She aggressively flipped open her black binder. The sharp snap of the metal rings echoed through the silent room like the cocking of a pistol. Brittany hastily ripped off her sunglasses. Her eyes were bloodshot and swollen. "We paid out of our own pockets to completely renovate that kitchen," she shrieked loudly. "Those improvements added massive value to the property, making us equitable partners." Sylvia turned to the first page of the binder. She traced her finger down a dense column of numbers. "Then let's discuss value," she stated, "and while we're at it, let's clarify exactly who paid for that value." She pulled out an Excel spreadsheet. It was the autopsy report of their lavish, superficial lifestyle. "Exhibit A," Sylvia said, sliding a copy across the table to Henderson. "This is a comprehensive ledger detailing every single living expense incurred for the Oak Creek property over the past 60 months. Henderson frowned, picking up the paper to examine it. Sylvia began to read, sounding like a soulless accounting machine. "Mortgage payments, including principal and interest. Total paid over 5 years, $312. She looked up. "Did you contribute a single dime to that, Brandon?" Brandon slightly shook his head. "No, next, property taxes," Sylvia continued. "Total over 5 years, $60,000. Brittany squirmed uncomfortably in her chair. "Parents are supposed to help their children." Sylvia ignored her. "Total insurance premiums, $18. She turned the page. The rustling of the paper was the only sound in the room. "Routine maintenance and repair fees," Sylvia announced loudly. "Every single one without exception was paid in full by Mr. Douglas Carter." She paused, aiming a razor-sharp glare at Brittany. "You mentioned the landscaping earlier, Ms. Brittany. You simply pointed your expensive manicured finger at a catalog, and my client dutifully pulled out his checkbook and paid for it." Brittany's face instantly flushed a hideous shade of purple. "But that is my intellectual property." Sylvia didn't even bother dignifying that absurd logic with a response. She flipped to another page. "Now, let's dissect your claim of blood, sweat, and tears regarding the kitchen renovation. You loudly insist that you paid $12,000 out of pocket for those marble countertops." "Yes, we did!" Brittany screamed, desperately grabbing onto this lifeline like a drowning victim. "I still have the bank statements to prove it." Sylvia nodded. "But let's trace the exact origin of those funds." She pulled out a promissory note, heavily stamped with a red date seal. "Exactly 2 weeks before the kitchen renovation officially began," Sylvia stated loudly, holding the document up for everyone to see. "Here is the promissory note, containing both of your original signatures, legally committing to repay the principal amount plus 3% interest on demand." She slammed the paper down onto the table. "Therefore," Sylvia concluded coldly, "you brazenly used $12,000 of my client's hard-earned money to install stone countertops in my client's house. In the legal world, we have a more accurate term for that: embezzlement." Henderson's eyes darted wildly across the papers scattered on the table. He started sweating profusely, slowly realizing he had just walked himself into a slaughterhouse. "All right, listen," Henderson stammered, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "We can easily argue that Mr. Carter intentionally created an expectation of permanent residency for my clients." I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the table. "Expectation?" I asked. "You completely deluded yourselves into believing that you were entitled to those privileges by default." Brandon looked up at me. His eyes were filled with absolute, desperate pleading. "Dad, please stop, for Leo's sake." For a fleeting second, I felt a sharp, gut-wrenching pain in my chest. I remembered the way they had looked at me during that backyard barbecue party, treating me like a walking leather wallet. Nothing more, nothing less. Sylvia quickly cut in before I could say another word. "We are not here to negotiate a lease extension," she announced, her voice as cold as ice. "We are here to discuss the counterclaim." "Counterclaim?" Henderson stammered blindly. "What counterclaim?" Sylvia smiled. It was the smile of a great white shark smelling blood in the water. "Unjust enrichment," she enunciated every single syllable. She violently flipped to the very last page of the black binder. Printed on the paper was a single massive number at the bottom, circled in bright red ink. "Because you have loudly declared that you are not mere guests, but fully legitimate tenants," Sylvia explained clearly, "and as tenants, you are legally required to pay rent." She slid the paper across the table. "The current market rate for a 4-bedroom house on Oak Creek Road is approximately $3.00 a month. Since no formal lease agreement ever existed between the parties, and you are now brazenly claiming squatters' rights, we are officially demanding retroactive back rent for the entire duration you have occupied the property." Brandon's jaw dropped in absolute terror. You're charging us back rent for the last 5 years?" Sylvia nodded emotionlessly. "Plus all legal fees associated with this eviction lawsuit." She turned her sharp gaze directly onto Henderson. "The total outstanding debt your clients currently owe to the Carter Family Trust is $235,400. The room plunged into a dead, suffocating silence. It was a life sentence for an incompetent couple who couldn't even afford to host a simple birthday party. Brittany began to hyperventilate. She gasped for air, clutching her chest tightly. "You can't. We'll be completely bankrupt." Sylvia slammed the binder shut. The sound was a permanent period at the end of a sentence. "Then I highly suggest you bow your heads and accept our settlement offer," she ruled. "Settlement?" Henderson asked, his voice weak and pathetic. "What are your terms?" Sylvia pulled out a single, thin sheet of paper and slid it across the table. "Unconditional surrender and voluntary vacate agreement," she read clearly. "The terms are as follows. First, you will voluntarily pack your belongings and vacate the premises within the next 7 days. Exactly 7 days. Second, you will surrender the property in pristine, completely undamaged condition. If you dare steal so much as a burnt-out light bulb, we will immediately press criminal charges. Third, you will sign this waiver, officially acknowledging in writing that you have absolutely no rights, financial claims, or disputes regarding the property or the family trust. And what do we get in return?" Henderson mumbled quietly. "In return," Sylvia stated loudly, "Mr. Douglas Carter will officially forgive the entire debt. He is graciously offering you a way out, allowing you to walk away with a perfectly clean credit score, owing him absolutely nothing, taking only the clothes on your backs." She leaned forward, her eyes piercing. "But if you refuse to sign, I promise you, I will drag this case through the courts for years. I will ensure that every single dollar you earn through blood, sweat, and tears, for the next 20 years, goes straight into your father's pocket to pay off this debt." She stared directly at Brandon. "Do you want a chance to start completely over, Brandon? Or do you want to be a slave to a mortgage debt for the rest of your life, chained by your own stupid arrogance?" Brandon stared blankly at the settlement agreement. He had foolishly brought a plastic water gun to a nuclear war. His hands shook violently as he reached out to grab the pen. He could barely hold it steady. "Dad," he whispered weakly. He looked up into my eyes one last time. I stared straight back into the depths of his soul. I didn't blink. "Sign it, Brandon," I ordered in a commanding tone. "It will undoubtedly be the most expensive signature of your entire life, but it is still infinitely cheaper than the alternative." He gritted his teeth and signed the paper. He signed away all his rights to the house. He single-handedly crushed the glorious illusion he had lived in for the past 5 years. Brittany had no choice but to follow suit. She hastily scribbled her name, salty tears dripping down and smudging the black ink on the paper. Sylvia coldly collected the documents. She nodded in satisfaction. Done, she declared. The locks will be completely changed at exactly 12:01 a.m. Brandon stumbled to his feet. He looked at me with a mixture of profound respect and sheer terror. The look of a lowly soldier who had just witnessed a powerful general order a devastating airstrike. "Goodbye, Dad," he breathed out. I didn't return the farewell. I didn't even wish him luck. "See you around." I casually dismissed him. They slowly shuffled out of the conference room in single file. Henderson trailed behind them, looking like an absolute failure, desperate to crawl back home and seriously reconsider his cheap legal career. When the door clicked shut, the silence flooded back into the room. It was the silence of true lasting peace. Sylvia let out a long, heavy sigh of relief. She picked up the $235,400 invoice and ripped it in half. "You knew we were never actually going to collect that ridiculous back rent, didn't you?" She smiled mischievously. "It was just a psychological bluff." I stood up and strolled over to the window. A rare, brilliant ray of warm sunlight pierced through the storm clouds, hitting the office building across the street. "I know," I smiled back, "and that is the fundamental difference between people who actually build the world and parasites who just feed off it." I turned to look at her. "Call the photographer back, Sylvia. I hear those Italian marble countertops are worth a fortune." I strode out of the office. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with fresh air. I no longer had to carry the heavy burden of a freeloading son. I was 68 years old, and for the very first time in my long life, I was truly, completely free. The messy, bloody death of my son's fake marriage didn't happen quietly in a dignified courtroom. A screaming match right on the front lawn proved to be a far more entertaining spectacle than any cheap reality TV show. Mrs. Higgins, an elderly neighbor across the street, later eagerly told me that in all her years, she had never seen a woman violently shove clothes into an expensive Louis Vuitton suitcase with such frantic, ruthless rage. People love to preach the empty cliché that money can't buy happiness. But it sure as hell can expose the absolute worst in people. Brittany had married him for richer or poorer, but the poorer part was an undeniable deal-breaker. The cracks had started the moment they walked out of Sylvia's office. Brittany wasn't mourning the loss of a home. She was crying over the evaporation of their luxury ski trip to Aspen. By Wednesday, the massive moving trucks had arrived, but they weren't moving together. Brittany had frantically called her parents for rescue. She only packed a selfish survival kit for herself. The explosive confrontation on the driveway was the grand finale. Brandon tearfully asked her how they were going to survive, how they were going to hold hands and weather this terrible storm together. She laughed right in his face. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed across the green lawn for all the nosy neighbors to hear. "Together," she shrieked, the veins popping in her neck. "You are just a sinking ship." She angrily threw herself into her car, slammed it into reverse, and floored the gas pedal, leaving dark, burnt tire tracks on the driveway as she sped away. She filed for divorce the very next morning, oblivious to the harsh reality that 40% of an unemployment check couldn't even buy a cheap bottle of champagne. Brandon was left utterly alone on the driveway of a vacant house. He was forced to stare directly into the naked reality of his own incompetence. He spent the next 2 days silently packing his few remaining personal items into a shady rental storage unit. Stripped of Brittany's extravagant decorations and the expensive furniture I had bought, his entire life's possessions fit perfectly into the back seat of a cheap rental car. At exactly noon on Monday, adhering strictly to Sylvia's agreement, he placed the house keys on the marble kitchen island. Unemployed, with zero savings and a rapidly plummeting credit score, he was completely radioactive to any decent landlord. He had no choice but to check into the Starlight Motel, a rundown, depressing dump on the absolute outskirts of town. He confined himself to that dark, smelly motel room for days, suffering through the painful withdrawal symptoms of privilege. For 32 years, he had been safely insulated inside a sterile glass bubble, completely immune to consequences. But now, consequences had become his ruthless, permanent roommate. He half-heartedly sent out a few resumes. He honestly believed I would eventually text him, telling him the lesson was over, that he had suffered enough, and that I had generously rented him a luxury downtown condo. But his phone never rang, never. Then came the final crushing humiliation. On a gloomy Tuesday night, exactly 2 weeks after his eviction, I legally removed myself as the guarantor of his auto loan. The bank wasted no time. A tow truck arrived at the motel. Brandon frantically ran outside, desperately, trying to explain that he was Brandon Carter, a powerful vice president, a man of status. The tow truck driver ignored him completely. Brandon stood barefoot on the filthy, foul-smelling asphalt of the motel parking lot, helplessly watching his very last connection to the civilized, upper-class world being forcefully dragged away. He was incredibly small. He retreated to his damp room, officially hitting absolute rock bottom. There is a very specific, iconic sound a man makes when his spirit is completely broken and crushed. It is the sound of absolute surrender. Brandon sobbed uncontrollably. He reached for his phone with trembling hands and dialed my number. I was wide awake. I desperately wanted to put an end to his agonizing pain. But my engineer's logic reminded me that if I did, all of this suffering would be completely wasted. If I saved him now, he would never learn how to save himself. He needed to realize that he possessed the strength to survive this. The phone finally stopped ringing. Instead, he made a decision I hadn't expected. Early the next morning, Brandon put on his only clean suit. He walked 3 grueling miles to the nearest Home Depot. He didn't go to a prestigious construction firm. He went straight to the store manager. "I desperately need a job. I just need to work," he said, looking the manager directly in the eyes. The manager looked at his suit, then at the desperate plea in his eyes, and quietly handed him an application. Brandon sat on an upside-down plastic bucket in the lumber aisle and filled it out. When he reached the emergency contact section, he hesitated. He was completely alone in the world, and for the first time in his life, that was exactly where he needed to be. His fall from grace had been a devastating, fatal blow. But standing there, breathing in the scent of sawdust and lumber, he was about to discover something priceless he had never owned: self-respect. It was a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks after his eviction. My son finally returned to the house he once thought he would inherit. The hydrangeas were in full bloom, completely indifferent to the human tragedies that had just unfolded around them. I was sitting on the porch bench, sanding the final edges of the bookcase for Leo. It was solid and ready to bear any weight. I looked up and saw Brandon slowly walking up the driveway. He was limping slightly, perhaps from a blister, or perhaps from the crushing weight of shame on his shoulders. He didn't look like a powerful VP anymore. He looked like a battered man who had just survived a hurricane. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, knowing he had permanently lost the privilege to simply walk up. "Hi, Dad," he croaked, his voice rough and hoarse. "Hello, Brandon," I replied calmly. I didn't offer him a seat. He stared at his cheap, heavily scuffed sneakers. You were right about everything." I narrowed my eyes. I saw genuine fear in him. "I accept your apology." I nodded calmly. He snapped his head up, a tiny sliver of hope lighting up his eyes. He took a step forward. "Thank you. I just need a little push." There it was. His apology might have been genuine, but it was also a master key he was trying to use to unlock the bank vault. "I really need some money for a deposit on an apartment," he spoke rapidly. "I'll do whatever you ask." I looked deep into his eyes. It was such a cheap price to pay for peace of mind. But I looked at the bookcase. It was time for me to be the reinforced steel beams. I reached into my chest pocket and pulled out a white envelope. Brandon's eyes locked onto it like a magnet. He let out a massive sigh of relief, his shoulders dropping as if a 1,000-pound weight had been lifted. "I knew you wouldn't let me drown," he whispered, tears welling up. "Thank you." I slowly walked down the steps. He pulled the paper out. It wasn't a check. Pinned to the application form was a business card for a foreman named Miller. Brandon stared at the paper in shock. There was no money. What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice shaking. "It's an honest day's work," I answered clearly. "He is currently hiring general laborers and dock workers." "It's backbreaking labor, Brandon. It pays $18 an hour, $18. Brandon looked at me in absolute horror. I can't survive on a pathetic $18 an hour. You can survive, I firmly asserted. And you will learn how to pinch pennies and save every single dime. I begged you for a loan, he screamed, his voice cracking. I begged you to help me. This is help, I fired back. You always believed you were entitled to enjoy the fruits of labor you never actually performed. I stepped closer, looking him dead in the eye. If I hand you that money today, you will drag yourself back to these steps in exactly 1 month demanding more. But if you take this job, if you grit your teeth and drag yourself to that site every day, if you learn what it feels like to be exhausted from hard work instead of petty anxiety, maybe, just maybe, you can transform into the man I always believed you could be. He furiously crushed the paper in his fist. Tears of pure frustration rolled down his cheeks. You are a cruel, sadistic man, he sobbed. You are thoroughly enjoying my suffering, aren't you? I am not enjoying a single second of this tragedy, I replied, my voice choking with restrained emotion. I am standing here watching my own flesh and blood bleed out, and I have to refuse you a bandage because I know that this infected wound needs to be exposed to the open air to heal. I pointed at the crushed paper in his hand. Miller expects you at the docks at 5 a.m. tomorrow. You can throw that paper in the trash and walk away, or you can drag yourself onto a bus and go to work. I turned my back decisively. He didn't move. I picked up the sandpaper and continued my work. I heard the wind rustling through the hydrangeas, and then I heard footsteps fading away. I wearily closed my eyes. A few hours later, my phone vibrated, a short text from Sylvia. He just called Miller. He starts tomorrow morning. I let out a long, heavy sigh of immense relief. He had decided to grab the fishing rod instead of begging for a gutted fish. I opened my phone gallery, then called a florist, 3 states away, ordering the brightest bouquet to be delivered to Brittany's parents' house, with a small card that simply read, "For Leo." I am not a villain. I am simply a father who, after all these years, finally understood the delicate line between genuine love and blind, toxic enabling. People mistakenly believe that love must always feel like a soft, warm blanket. Sometimes, love is standing firmly in the doorway, coldly saying no, and forcing the person you love the most to struggle and find their own way to survive adversity. The price of this lesson was temporarily losing my relationship with my son. I used cruelty to buy back his lost self-respect, and I bought eternal peace for my own soul. Tomorrow I will personally carry this bookcase to the post office. Then I will sit quietly and watch the crashing waves pound against the towering cliffs, patiently wearing them down over the centuries, turning sharp, jagged rocks into smooth, refined sand. Life is incredibly harsh, but it is precisely in the moments of being broken and shattered that we truly discover the core material we are made of. I am Douglas Carter, and today, for the very first time in my life, I have laid the first brick to build a family foundation that will truly stand the test of time. Thank you for patiently listening to my life story. See you in the next one.